The report says he died in less than 3 minutes. Direct blast. Body unrecoverable. File closed. But wars do not happen on paper, they happen on the ground. And the ground does not always confirm what was written. In modern conflicts where drones see from above and satellites watch from space, there is still something that escapes: the moment after. The instant when someone was supposed to be dead but wasn't. At least, not yet. Imagine an American soldier declared dead in a zone where no one can return to confirm. Constant fire, unstable terrain, broken communication. For command, the equation is simple. No body, no recovery, no choice. The war moves on. But what if, in that ignored interval between the explosion and the silence, someone was still breathing? Wounded, isolated, invisible to both sides. Alive where the war had already decided life should no longer exist. Military history is filled with gaps that were never closed. Soldiers listed as dead who reappeared days later. Others who never returned, but were never found either. These cases rarely make headlines, because they do not fit the official narrative. They have no clean ending, no victory, no defeat. Only time passing under conditions that were never supposed to allow it. What keeps someone alive when there is no rescue, when training runs out and only instinct remains? How long can a body endure without clean water, without treatment, without real rest? And more importantly, why do we almost never talk about what may have happened after the radio stopped responding? Perhaps because admitting this means accepting that war does not end when we say it ends. Sometimes it continues alone, in silence, far from any record. This is not a story about classic heroism. It is not about medals or spectacular rescues. It is about the interval, about the time that never made it into the report, about the real possibility that someone survived the impossible, only to disappear without leaving a trace. And if this happened once, how many others never reached us at all?
Modern wars are not made only of great battles or political decisions. They are made of small, isolated moments in which a single person is left alone with their own body, their own mind, and the uncertainty of how much time is left. In conflicts involving American troops, especially from the late 20th century onward, there have been numerous documented cases of soldiers who survived situations considered fatal. What is rarely discussed is that, among these confirmed cases, there exists a gray zone where incomplete facts blend with perfectly plausible hypotheses. It is within this space that the most unsettling stories are born, because they require no fantasy, only logic, time, and silence. In war zones such as Afghanistan and Iraq, the environment itself is already an active enemy. Extreme temperatures, uneven terrain, constant dust, mountains, destroyed cities, and routes that can shift from safe to deadly within hours. American convoys often operated with information that was already outdated the moment it was received. A stretch of road considered clear in the morning could become an ambush by night. When an attack happens, chaos comes, not only from the enemy but from the urgent need to act quickly, evacuate the wounded, return fire, and maintain functional communication. It is within this context that mistakes occur, not due to incompetence, but because the human system has limits. In several conflicts, there are official records of soldiers declared killed in action who were later found alive, in some cases hours later, in others days later. These episodes usually involve explosions, temporary loss of consciousness, separation from the unit, or failures in visual confirmation. On a real battlefield, it is not always possible to accurately verify vital signs, especially when there is imminent danger and an immediate withdrawal is required. When someone does not respond, does not move, and is at the epicenter of an explosion, the conclusion is often made quickly. War does not allow waiting. Now imagine a plausible situation built from these same real elements. An American convoy moves during the early hours of the morning through a mountainous region. Visibility is low, fatigue is high, and attention is no longer at its ideal level. An explosion hits one of the vehicles, followed by gunfire from elevated positions. The response is immediate but confused. A soldier is thrown outside the main blast radius, suffers severe injuries, loses his radio, and falls unconscious. When the area is partially secured and evacuation begins, the focus is on visible wounded and confirmed bodies. Someone is declared dead simply because he is no longer there. This is the first possible failure, and it requires neither conspiracy nor extreme negligence. It requires only seconds of decision under pressure. If that soldier regains consciousness hours later, alone, injured, disoriented, and without functioning equipment. He does not think about strategy, heroism, or mission. He thinks about breathing. The human body, when placed in a limit situation, reduces its priorities to the essential. Pain becomes constant background noise. Hunger and thirst begin to compete with the need to remain hidden. Military training helps, but it does not turn anyone into a machine. It merely increases the chances of a correct reaction in the first moments. Surviving behind enemy lines does not mean constant movement. Often, it means remaining still for hours, even days, waiting for the least dangerous moment to move a few meters. Trained soldiers know that movement draws attention, noise kills, and impulsive decisions are fatal. A wounded man, possibly with fractures, burns, or internal bleeding, would hardly be able to walk long distances, but he could crawl, hide, and use terrain in darkness. This is not fantastical speculation. It is something that has already happened in previous conflicts, including with American soldiers. Reports from local civilians in war zones are common and, in most cases, still, they are part of the informal record of conflict. People living in these regions are accustomed to seeing armed men, foreigners, and the wounded. When multiple reports point to something similar, even without official confirmation, they cannot be automatically dismissed. A foreign man, injured, moving at night, avoiding contact during the day, is not an impossible figure in an active war scenario. On the contrary, it is exactly the kind of thing that could pass unnoticed by official reports. If that soldier survived for more than a day or two, the greatest challenge would no longer be physical, but psychological. Sleep deprivation, constant pain, untreated infection, and absolute uncertainty about rescue create an unstable mental state. Time loses definition. Hours feel like days, days feel like weeks. Many survivors report that, in extreme situations, the mind begins to operate in short cycles, focused only on the next minimal action required to stay alive. There is no long-term planning, only immediate survival. Here arises an uncomfortable but realistic possibility. If this soldier did not manage to return to Allied forces and was not officially rescued, he becomes invisible to both sides. To the enemy, he is merely another body that may or may not be found. To his own military, he is already dead on paper. This kind of limbo does not appear in films, but it is known to military historians. There are documented cases of combatants who disappeared without clear confirmation of death, simply because there was not enough information to reverse their official status. Even if he survived for weeks, the odds would decrease sharply over time. The injured body demands its price. Infections worsen, the lack of antibiotics, proper bandaging, and consistent nutrition creates progressive deterioration. At some point, survival ceases to be active and becomes passive. The person no longer fights to escape, only to endure another day. This is not weakness. It is the human limit. War does not care about these limits. It continues regardless of what happens to isolated individuals. What makes this type of story so disturbing is that there is no clear ending. There is no cinematic rescue moment, nor definitive confirmation of death. There are only gaps, and gaps are common in armed conflicts. Official history needs dates, numbers, and conclusions, but reality, especially in modern wars, often leaves questions unanswered. How many people survived longer than expected? How many died outside official records? How many stories were never told because there was no one left to tell them? When a report states that someone died in combat, it closes an administrative process, not necessarily the absolute truth. War is an environment where information arrives broken, delayed, or never arrives at all. Surviving the impossible does not always mean returning home. Sometimes it means simply having lived longer than the system believed possible. And that alone already challenges everything we think we know about war, survival, and the human limit. The historical foundation for this type of narrative is not fragile. On the contrary, throughout wars involving the United States, especially from the Korean War onward, there are formal records of soldiers who were declared dead, listed as missing, or considered only to have their true condition clarified much later. Some reappeared alive. Others never had a fully confirmed outcome. What all these cases share is the same structural characteristic. Modern war is too fragmented, decentralized, and chaotic to guarantee absolute certainty in every event. This creates a real space where stories like this not only can exist, but likely existed more often than is openly acknowledged. During the Vietnam War, for example, there were numerous cases of American soldiers who survived for days or weeks after being separated from their units. The jungle, like the desert or the mountains, is not merely a hostile environment. It is also a place that hides. Many of these men survived by moving only at night, avoiding any kind of human contact, drinking contaminated water, eating as little as possible, and enduring injuries that, in any other context, would have been considered fatal. What kept these soldiers alive was not superhuman strength, but a combination of basic training, instinct, and chance. Chance, in war, is as decisive a factor as any weapon. When this logic is applied to more recent conflicts, such as Afghanistan and Iraq, the scenario changes technologically, but not humanly. Drones, satellites, and advanced communication do not eliminate the human factor on the ground. On the contrary, they create a false sense of total control. There are still blind spots, failures in thermal readings, misinterpretations, and, above all, situations in which there is simply no time or safety to confirm everything. A body that is not found becomes a logistical problem. A body found under extreme conditions can be classified incorrectly. War accepts these imperfections as an operational cost. If that hypothetical soldier remained alive for a prolonged period, another element would come into play: forced adaptation. The human body begins to conserve energy, reducing movement to the minimum necessary. The mind enters a nearly automatic state, where decisions are made without conscious reflection. Many survivors of extreme situations report that they stop feeling their bodies clearly. Pain becomes background noise. Emotions flatten. Fear does not disappear, but transforms into something constant, almost functional. This psychological state is not sustainable indefinitely, but it can last long enough to keep someone alive beyond what would normally be expected. There is also the possibility of indirect contact with local civilians, something that rarely appears in official records. In many wars, civilians have helped wounded soldiers not out of ideology, but out of basic humanity, self-interest, or pure chance. A bit of water left quietly, an improvised shelter, a minimal gesture that makes the difference between dying that night or surviving one more day. These acts almost never enter military reports because they cannot be verified and often are not even known to the forces involved. Still, they are part of the reality of conflict. Over time, however, the odds decrease drastically. The injured body demands its price. Infections worsen. The lack of antibiotics, proper wound care, and consistent nourishment creates a gradual decline. Even someone extremely determined cannot sustain this indefinitely. And here emerges one of the most uncomfortable parts of this plausible story: delayed death. Not in the dramatic moment of the explosion, but days or weeks later, in absolute silence, far from any camera, report, or official witness. When this happens, the military system never corrects the initial record. The soldier was already officially dead. Nothing changes. There is no deep investigation, no revision, no administrative need. The file remains closed. The story ends there, on paper, but what actually happened between the declaration and the real end remains unknown, and that interval may contain a struggle for survival that will never be recognized. This type of gap is not exclusive to modern wars. It appears in virtually every major conflict in history. What changes is how we deal with it. In ancient wars, it was accepted that many simply vanished. In modern wars, there is the illusion that everything is recorded, filmed, and monitored. This illusion makes these stories even more disturbing, because we know that, despite all the technology, we still have not eliminated human disappearance in extreme environments. From a collective psychological standpoint, admitting that someone may have survived beyond expectations, suffered alone, and died outside the official record is deeply uncomfortable. It breaks the clean narrative of war, where there are clear heroes, confirmed deaths, and defined endings. Reality is more fragmented, more ambiguous, more human, and that is precisely why stories like this continue to surface. Even when there is not enough proof to transform them into absolute facts, when we speak of American soldiers who survived the impossible, we are not speaking only of extraordinary physical feats. We are speaking of structural failures, human limits, and gray zones where truth is not fully accessible. Surviving the impossible, in this context, does not mean winning the war or returning home with medals. It means challenging, even if temporarily, the cold logic of reports and statistics. It means existing where existence was not expected. And perhaps the heaviest part of this story is precisely this: not knowing how long he lived, not knowing who saw him for the last time, not knowing whether there was hope in his final moments or only exhaustion. War moves forward without answering these questions. It always has, and it likely always will. When conflicts are observed with some historical distance, it becomes clear that most of what we know is constructed from what was recorded, not necessarily from what was lived. Military records, even the most detailed ones, are administrative instruments before they are human narratives. They exist to classify events, organize data, and allow the war to continue functioning as a system. Within this logic, the improbable survival of a single isolated soldier is noise, something that does not alter the strategic course and therefore rarely receives prolonged attention. This mismatch between individual but experience and institutional machinery is what allows stories like this to exist without ever being fully confirmed or denied. In wars involving American forces, especially in complex theaters of operation, the figure of the isolated soldier is not theoretical. It appears in manuals, training programs, and evasion protocols. Soldiers are trained for the possibility of separation from their unit, to survive with minimal resources, and to avoid direct contact until rescue becomes viable. This alone confirms that the hypothesis is not absurd. What is rarely discussed is what happens when this training meets an injured, exhausted, and psychologically compromised body. Manuals do not account for gradual collapse. They only describe the ideal survival scenario. If this hypothetical soldier managed to stay alive long enough, another phenomenon begins to emerge: the progressive loss of military identity. Without communication, without hierarchy, without a clear mission, he ceases to function as a soldier and begins to exist solely as an individual. Trying to continue breathing, the uniform loses meaning. Insignia no longer matter. The enemy stops being a clearly defined entity and becomes anything that represents danger, including sounds, unfamiliar people, and even the impulse to move too much. This state is profoundly dehumanizing because it dismantles everything that training and military life are built upon. In real accounts from survivors of extreme situations, there is a common point that rarely appears in heroic narratives. The moment when hope ceases to be a conscious engine, there is no longer an expectation of rescue at a specific time or a reunion with the unit. There is only the refusal to die in that moment. This is not courage in the classical sense. It is biological and psychological resistance. The body continues functioning because it has not stopped yet, not because there is a clear plan. This detail is crucial to understanding why some people survive longer than expected, while others, in seemingly similar conditions, do not. At this stage, time ceases to be linear. Days blend together. The soldier may not know how long he has been alone. The sense of recent past fragments, memories of life before the war surface randomly, without clear emotional connection. Some survivors describe this state as a partial disengagement from reality, where the mind creates distance in order to endure continuous stress. This is not delirium in a clinical sense, but an extreme adaptation to an unbearable environment. Once again, none of this is extraordinary or supernatural. It is human beings pushed to their limits. If death finally occurs at this point, it does not happen the way films portray it. There are no last words, no moments of clarity. It is usually quiet, preceded by deep exhaustion, infection, or progressive physical failure. No one witnesses it. No one records it. The location may never be found, or if it is, there is no way to connect that body to a specific event. The official story remains intact. Killed on the day of the ambush. Everything that happened afterward simply does not exist for the institutional world. This is the part that disturbs the most, because it reveals a difficult truth. War does not register suffering proportionally to time lived. A soldier who dies instantly and another who survives weeks under extreme conditions can receive exactly the same single line in a report. The difference between them exists only in lived reality, not in written history. This creates a chasm between what happened and what is remembered. and that chasm will never be fully closed. Over the decades, military historians have pointed out that the number of missing persons in modern wars is smaller than in ancient conflicts. But that does not mean the phenomenon has disappeared. It means it has changed form. Instead of mass disappearances, there are isolated cases, difficult to investigate and easy to close administratively. Each of these cases carries the possibility of a story like this, even if it is never told. When we speak of American soldiers who survived the impossible, it is important to understand that the impossible is not only in the initial explosion or the severe injury. The impossible lies in continuity, in waking up the next day when everything indicated there would be no next day, in enduring one more night, one more pain, one more absolute silence. This does not produce classic heroes or inspiring endings. It produces only an uncomfortable question. How many of these stories existed without anyone ever knowing? There is no final proof, no direct testimony, no document that closes the case. There is only sustained by historical facts, fragmented reports, and an understanding of human behavior under extreme stress. And paradoxically, this makes it more real than many confirmed stories, because war, when observed closely, is made far more of gaps than of certainties. Ending this story does not mean resolving it. It means accepting that, somewhere between the moment of the explosion and the closing of the report, there may have been a life that continued longer than the world believed. And even if we never know the name, the face, or the final fate, that possibility alone is enough to break the clean narrative of war. It reminds us that surviving the impossible does not always leave visible marks on history, only silent echoes that no one learns in school and that rarely appear in books, but that nonetheless were part of someone's reality. Here, the narrative can finally slow down, not to offer comfort, but to let the weight of what has been said settle. Because war does not need grand endings to be brutal. Sometimes all it does is move forward, while entire stories are left behind, without confirmation, without recognition, and without a voice. Perhaps the greatest discomfort comes from the fact that there is no way to conclude this narrative definitively.